welcome to section 3.5 of Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. I'm Jake Thibault. This goes along with the book, and this is section 3.5, the document Male and Female, He Created Them, which we'll jump right into. So you can either watch just these videos, or you could read along with the book. But you fill in more of the gaps when you read the book along with the presentation. But some people, you might only do one or the other. So in 2019, a document came out from the Congregation of Catholic Education called "Male and Female, He Created Them." So if you're not totally familiar with Catholic structures, which is understandable, even most practicing Catholics are not, which is fine. You know, the ability to say the church says, right? The church says, or the church teaches, is something that comes from the Holy See. So if something comes from the Holy See itself, then it has an authoritative, universal reach to it. Now, there is the Holy See in Rome. In the Vatican, there's the Holy See, but there are also offices in the Vatican, which are pastoral offices. You might have a office of liturgy, office of Catholic education, office of mission, offices that deal with ecumenism. Right? There's all types of offices in the Vatican. Not all of them are the Holy See. So this is one of those congregations within the Vatican. So the Congregation for Catholic Education. Now, so just because the congregation writes something doesn't mean the church says, right? So, and usually the documents make that very clear right off the bat, and this one is no exception. So why is the Congregation for Catholic Education going to write on the transgender issue? Well, because the church runs thousands and thousands of schools, right? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of schools around the world. So if we're talking about transgender youth in particular, right? If this were about Caitlyn Jenner, well, the Congregation for Catholic Education wouldn't be writing about this. But this is written to the effect that it has an effect on the youth, right? The effect that it might have on Catholic education. So from kindergarten all the way up through probably Catholic colleges and universities. So this is an issue for that age group. So when we begin the document from Male and Female, He Created Them, the first part of it is addressing feminism more than anything, right? It's addressing issues of feminism and gender, and the church in this congregation, they're particularly they're praising feminist efforts, right? They're praising it, saying, you know, some of this feminism that's popped up in the last half a century, last century, or it has been very good, right? It's gotten rid. It's helped put a focus on abuse of women, exploitation of women, abuse of women, right? Women having more freedom is a wonderful thing, right? Women should be treated equal to men in the public sphere, and feminism, through its efforts, has put a light on it and has made changes, which is positive. This is the congregation's perspective. Now, after it goes to feminism, it then gets into gender theory. And they say, well, and then there's gender theory. And gender theory is now asking all types of questions, right? All types of issues that is beyond feminism, right? It's beyond second wave feminism. It's now fourth wave feminism. And this is where the church ends up saying, and this is where we have a problem. But it makes a distinction. So at the first part of this latter part of the document, it's the Catholic education trying to address the issue of again, gender theory. It says, the view of both sexual identity and the family becomes subject to the same liquidity and fluidity that characterizes other aspects of postmodern culture, often founded on nothing more than a confused concept of freedom in the realm of feelings and wants, or momentary desires provoked by emotional impulses and the will of the individual, as opposed to anything based on the truth of existence. Now, I think that's a wonderful line. I think that's a very concise and good perspective of the church's response to gender theory. Now, this is very similar to something Pope Francis would say, or any Orthodox person would say, Benedict XVI or John Paul II, right? Is this criticizing women wanting equal opportunities in the workplace? No, it's not opposed to that at all, right? Is it opposed to people who are transgender or... No, it's not opposed to transgender people, right? There's nothing opposed to people with gender dysphoria. What is it critical of? Well, it's critical of postmodern culture, right? This is... It is criticizing the software that we have all been given grown up in Western culture. In Western culture, we have grown up with postmodernity as our framework, right? We're not growing up in a Catholic framework. Even if we are Catholic, you're not growing up in a Catholic framework. We're growing up in a postmodern framework. If you turn on the TV, what do you see? Postmodern. If you listen to the news, postmodern. You look at advertisements, you look at the mall, whatever you're involved in, the underlying message is post-modernity. And we touched on this with epistemology and other aspects, the idea of a personal gender theory. But the criticism that the church has, now I'm speaking broader of the church, not just this document, but it's separated entirely from reason. It's entirely separated from biology. It's separated from our nature. And it's based on feelings, wants, desires, the general ethic of that's taught to the young is whatever works for you, right? There is no objective truth. There's no objective morality. There's no objective anything. Everything is subjective, and it's simply a matter of my feelings and your feelings and our feelings, and who is anyone to make any type of determination about anything. As soon as you push people a little bit on this, so then you say, well, so then it was okay that Hitler murdered 6 million Jews because, it's all relative, and if you have one opinion, I have another opinion, then there's nothing objectively wrong about that. People say, oh, no, that was wrong, right? So as soon as you push people all of a sudden are not subjectivists, right? They're not relativists. But when they first open their mouth, the first thing that's going to fall out of their mouth is moral relativism, right? It's subjectivism. It's emotivism. This is the first instinct, right? It's uncritically spouted out, right? This is postmodernity. And it leads to this fluidity and liquidity. We talked about this again in epistemology. It's this John Locke idea that, well, if God does not exist, then there is no morality, right? There is no such thing as objective morality. People have bought that hook, line, and sinker, whether you are Catholic or Protestant, Jewish, whatever you are from the West. You have probably accepted that ideology until maybe you have critically challenged it. Now, at the university level, a lot of times we're not critically challenging that. We are enforcing it, right? In our attempts to show all perspectives, we end up enforcing this by saying, well, let's look at all perspectives, right? Look at all perspectives. But there's a difference between looking at all perspectives and being moral relativist or emotivist or subjectivist. Within this document, it's pointing out the problem of dualism, right? Section 20. The underlying presupposition of these theories can be tracked to a dualist anthropology, separating body, reducing to the status of inert matter, and human will, which itself becomes an absolute that can manipulate the body as it pleases. Again, that is a very on the spot observation about the perspective of the postmodern people, right? We go, and this has also been said earlier on with epistemology, but that we are dealing with half the people who believe it is just pure materialism, right? Everything is just materialism. All we are is raw datum, right? We're just flesh, right? Our minds are just brains. There's nothing beyond the brain and the body and the flesh, right? That's it, this materialism. On the other side, you have this this subjectivism, this skepticism, right? If you go back again to epistemology, where all we are is a mind, right? Who I am is who I feel that I am, who I think that I am. My body does not define me, right? You can hear this often at funerals. People talk this way, right? That they are just spirit and not body. You know, they're just leaving this body. But this perspective is just that whatever my mind says, well, that's who I really am, right? So I can match through surgery or whatever manipulation. I can change the world to manifest my internal reality. That's the perspective, and it is a growing perspective more and more, right? Anyway, yeah. Bishop Barron points out as well, you know, the body represents an antagonist which can and should be manipulated by authentic self, right? And this is very much online with what the congregation came out with in 2019. Bishop Barron said it first. But this is part of this kind of dualism, this Gnosticism, this idea that you just, you know, your true authentic self is who is your mind, and everything else just copies your mind, right? So that's all it is, which is why we end up with all these problems, right? Like things like Instagram dysmorphia, or, you know, the stuff they're coming out with from Facebook now or Instagram, saying, you know, young people, teenagers, particularly teenage girls, they get obsessed with things like Instagram and filters, Snapchat filters. And when they don't look like their filtered version of their self in real life, they end up getting stressed out, right? There's a disconnect that I don't look like my Instagram picture. Well, your Instagram picture was, you took 100 of them, you picked your 5 best, you filtered it, and then you cropped it, and then you put it out there, and everybody liked it. But that's just not what you look like, right? It's just not who we are. And if who we are causes stress because it doesn't match our mental vision of ourselves, well, the problem isn't us, it's our mental vision of ourselves, right? It's what we think. So is this really an issue? Right? I was listening to a TED Talk with Decker Moss, who was a female to male transgender person in a big room full of people, and everyone's clapping and agreeing. And what she said is, sex is assigned to us at the moment we are born by a doctor based solely on what is between our legs. But I think that this needs to change. And what Decker goes on to say is, you know, I don't want to be defined by what's between my legs. I want, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful if people just thought of me as a writer, as an outdoors person, as an adventurer, as a human being, right? Wouldn't that be better than what's between our legs? But I think arguably we can say it's this postmodernism and a little bit the transgender ideology. And if that trigger, go back to 2.1 where I go over ideology versus gender dysphoria. Section 2.2. Nobody's saying anything has to, you know, yes, be an adventurer, be a writer, be, you know, all these wonderful things. You're the one that's making it about gender, right? Saying, I'm born in the wrong gender, I'm not the right person. I want to be more than my gender. Well, then be more than your gender, right? Just be, I was born a woman. Okay, next, move on. live something more adventurous in your life. You know, nobody's saying that that has to define you. You're the one that's saying it has to define you. You're the one on a stage talking about it, right? You could have just moved on with your life. Instead, this has become an obsession. This is part of this kind of modern dualism where it's like, well, I don't want to be it's kind of very popular postmodern thing. I don't want to be defined by this. But then you spend all of your time defining yourself that way, right? Same thing within a lot of the LGBT movement is, you know, it's, well, I don't want this to define me. You know, I don't want people to define me that way. But then everything becomes revolving around that. So then it's like, well, who's the one that's who's the one that's really obsessing over it? You know, that's the question. So Pope Francis as well, he says, it is easy nowadays to confuse genuine freedom with the idea that each individual can arbitrarily, as if there was no truths, values, or principles to provide guidance, and everything was possible or permissible. Right? This is very much in line with this document, Male and Female. He created them. This idea that, you know, nothing is determinative. Right? Nothing defines you other than what you feel about yourself. And the CCE warns, the Congregation for Catholic Education, this combination of physicalism, kind of materialism, where you're just raw material, voluntarism, that material things don't define us, gives rise to relativism, an ethical theory that nothing means anything, in which everything exists of equal value and at the same time undifferentiated, without any real order or purpose, right? No teleology, right? So it's all these isms, right? This is really the point of this document at this point, is just, it's all isms, right? This is just ideology. It's physicalism, voluntarism, relativism. And the result of all these isms, all this ideology, is that nothing means anything. Nothing means anything. Nothing has a purpose. Nothing is going anywhere. So do whatever you want, right? Do whatever you want. Nothing matters. Nothing really matters. So if you want to be a boy, be a boy. If you want to be a girl, be a girl. If you want to be a dinosaur, be a dinosaur. Whatever. Nothing matters, right? Just you invent yourself, right? That is the ideology of postmodernity, which the CCE is criticizing. Now, I think you could probably be a non-religious person and still see some problems with this. You know, people like Jordan Peterson has put a lot of focus on this within his career, and he's not a particularly religious person, not ascribed to any creed or anything. But you know, you can see that there are people today who are now saying this doesn't really make sense, but they don't really have a solution. But the solution is really within the Catholic worldview, right? It's that probably gives more guidance than anything. Then we move to section 26. Now, section 26 is the most informative, the most challenging, the one that needs to be examined the most. So, the first part, again, was feminism. Now we're finally moving on to the transgender stuff, right? So we went into feminism, we went into ideology, and now we're getting into the transgender issue here in section 26. So if you're only interested in the transgender stuff, jump right to section 26. So the most crucial part of the document is in the reasoning section, which is long but worth quoting. So I quote pretty much all of section 26. First three parts. From the point of view of genetics, all cells which contain X, Y chromosomes differ from the very moment of conception from female cells with XX chromosomes. So pointing out, again, genetics. Right? This is not whatever you feel like. There is, from the moment of conception, a very biological and material determinate factor separating the sexes. Not all there is, but at the very moment of conception, this has been set out. That said, in cases where a person's sex is not clearly defined, it is medical professionals who can make therapeutic intervention. In such situations, parents cannot make an arbitrary choice on the issue, let alone society. So this is really talking about intersex. What happens when you have an intersex person where XX and XY are not determinative, not clearly defined, well then it should be medical professionals who step in. It shouldn't be anyone else. Now this is now the protocol for intersex individuals, is give time to allow the intersex individual to express themselves, and then you can more clearly figure out if they are male or female, right? Which is the protocol. Instead, medical science should act with a purely therapeutic end and intervene in the least invasive fashion on the basis of objective parameters and with the view of establishing a person's constitutive identity. So that's a lot in that sentence. But again, it's not necessarily the individual, although the medical community may turn to the individual for guidance as they do with the intersex condition. Any type of treatment should be therapeutic, right? It should have a therapeutic goal, which would be to fit in the binary system, right? So if you are female, that you kind of align with a female expression. If you are a male, that you align some way with a male expression. So, you know, if that means a double mastectomy, removing the breast so that you appear more male, then that could be a therapeutic thing, right? Or breast enhancements if you don't have breasts, you know, perhaps to be perceived as a female, if it's therapeutic, right? A therapeutic electrolysis, for example, could be therapeutic, and intervene in the least invasive fashion. So again, this would be saying, you know, maybe there is $1 million worth of plastic surgeries that could be done to make you align with your sex. Well, do you really need the $1 million worth of surgery? What is the least that needs to be done? What's a reasonable amount that needs to be done? Right, the least invasive. Right, this would be a matter. You know, maybe just some electrolysis and wear the appropriate gendered clothing. You know, you don't have to go to the extreme. And there's a number of transgender activist people who agree with this. Right, this isn't necessarily controversial. Right, not everyone, as we pointed out during the section on sex reassignment surgeries, not everyone who can get treatments get all the treatments, right? There's reasons why people don't. You know, this section here is not really distinguishing between intersex and transgender, so you can kind of read into it a bit. You know, so to kind of look at it, and I have to be careful because the next 3 sections also touch on this, so I don't want to let the air out of the balloon too soon. But a person's sex is, you know, number 2, a person's sex is not clearly defined. Well, what if the person has a feminized brain? The feminized brain might be more determinative than having breasts. Having a masculinized might be more determinative than having a penis, right? So this is still somewhat ambiguous, but what it would lay out as a principle here, and I know this is maybe stretching it a bit, but I think it's logically consistent. If a person were gender dysphoric, if it could be determined that they have an intersexed brain, this would still fit into this distinction, this clarification, right? So if a person had an intersexed brain, then the person would have a not clearly defined morphology, right? The brain morphology would be not clearly defined. A person's sex would not clearly be defined if they had an intersex brain. And then it would be medical professionals who should make the determination of the therapeutic intervention, right? How do you deal with an intersex brain? That goes to the medical community. And it should not be arbitrary, right? You just don't pick one over the other. And it shouldn't be the least, and it should be the least invasive means, right? What is the most natural transition, right? Not the most invasive, but the least invasive. So this leaves a bit of a gap, right? It doesn't leave a gap for social gender theory, right? It's not about what society thinks, it's about what's biologically true. And it's certainly against personal gender theory, because again, it's not about what you think about yourself, it's what's biologically true. There's still a question, and this is why I have chapter 7 and 8 on the science. But the biological truth needs to be understood, right? The actual medical studies on is this an intersex brain or not is very important, for this document. And then the last 4 in this section makes it more complicated. In some ways, it's, that one is simple. These 4 get more complicated, and it's where probably most people have the most opposition to this document would be these 4 statements in section 26. They say the process of identifying sexual identity is made more difficult by the fictitious contract known as gender neuter, or third gender, which has an effect of obscuring the fact that a person's sex is a structural determinant of male or female identity. So this would be, he says gender neuter, but non-binary, right? This is against non-binary. This idea that not some people are male and some people are female, but there's really 76 genders. There's an unlimited number of genders, whatever it is. There's a third gender. They would say this is rejected, right? Why is it rejected? Because a person's gender, right, gender neuter, gender non-binary, is determined by a person's structural determinants. The structural determinants, right? It's the one's biology. One's biology determines this, and there is no biological evidence to suggest there are 76 sexes. There are 2, right? 2 sexes. And gender is, from a traditional perspective, is a direct response to one's sex. So if there are 2 sexes, and a person's gender is their response to their sex, and acting out of their sex, then there are therefore 2 genders. That's it. You could say, well, I was born a male, but I like frilly dresses. Well, that's fine, but that's still a male who likes frilly dresses. It's not a new gender, right? You say, well, I'm a born female, but I'm not sexually attracted to anyone. Okay, that's not agender, right? Non-gender, right? An agender person. You are a female who's not very sexually attracted to people. It's a subclass of female, right? It's not a new gender because it's not a new sex. It's the same sex, same gender. You have different preferences. We are all different. Therefore, we all have different preferences. This is not a category that should be protected under law or something which needs to be, sensitivity training about this, or workplace policies about this. If you're a woman who's not interested in men and you work for Microsoft, who cares, right? Why would Microsoft care if you are interested in a romantic relationship or not, right? Sounds really irrelevant. You're going to a university and you're interested in people who look different. Well, who cares? Right? No one cares. This is a bit of the opposition Pope Francis and the hierarchy have against a lot of this postmodern theory. It's so self-centered. It's so focused on staring at the mirror and trying to proclaim to the world your identity, and everyone must react positive to my identity. Everyone must accept my identity. Everyone must celebrate my identity that I just came up with 5 minutes ago. The response of traditional culture is, who cares? Right? You don't have enough work to do because you're so obsessed with something that doesn't matter to anyone but you, and it shouldn't even matter to you. Right? This is this idea. Next, the part 2, efforts to go beyond the constitutive male-female sexual difference, such as the idea of intersex or transgender, lead to masculinity or femininity that is ambiguous, even though in a self-contradictory way. These concepts themselves actually presuppose the very sexual differentiation that they propose to negate or supersede. Right? So this one I had trouble with when I first started reading it, because the line, the ideas of intersex, that's something I really struggled with at the beginning, because I thought, the ideas of intersex is a biological reality, right? It's not, you could check the chromosomes, you could check the hormone levels, intersex isn't an idea, it is verifiable. Now, the transgender issue today is not always verifiable, so I could see you can have an idea of transgender, but intersex, well, this is determined by doctors, not people who just come up with it, which is why I would have I had a problem with it initially, until I started reading more on intersex stuff and realized, well, actually they're kind of onto something, because there are people who are using the topic of intersex, the idea of intersex, to create an ideology out of it. Now, this is most often, not done by people who are actually intersex. Most people who are actually intersex are just trying to live a normal binary life, right? They're just trying to fit in, right? That's the average person. There are some people who are not, but more often it's people who are not intersex, who are using intersex people as an example of sex being a spectrum, for example. See, not everyone is male or female. There's intersex. So, there's on one side really male and on one side really female, and everybody else is somewhat of a spectrum in between because of intersex. Well, that's now an ideology, right? This is now not a scientific fact. It's an ideology, which is what the Congregation for Catholic Education is standing against. And what it's pointing out fairly correctly but complicatedly is that it self-contradicts, right? These ideas self-contradict to say, well, sex is a spectrum, gender is a spectrum, everything's a spectrum. Well, if you're saying that sex is not determinative, then why does it matter if it's a spectrum? If you're saying there are 8 genders, eight sexes, then you could say, well, there would be 8 genders. But you're saying that there's really no connection between sex and gender anyway, so why does it even matter, right? And a person can't be intersexed. A person can't be transgender if everybody is everything, right? If you're saying sex doesn't matter and it's not determinative of gender, then there is no such thing as transgender, because everyone is transgender. Right? In a sense. I know that's confusing, but this is addressed multiple times later where it's clearer. So I'll kind of leave it at that. This oscillation between male and female becomes, at the end of the day, provocative display against so-called traditional frameworks, and one which, in fact, ignores the suffering of those who have a live-in situations of sexual indeterminacy. Now, this is the pastoral part coming out more, where, this is, again, the umbrella of transgender ideology versus the umbrella of gender dysphoria. By all these people saying, well, sex is a spectrum, sex doesn't matter, gender's a spectrum. Gender doesn't matter. There's 100 genders. There's unlimited genders. It's really not respecting the fact that some people are gender dysphoric or intersexed, right? Biologically intersexed and perhaps with some type of gender dysphoria, and they're not choosing this, right? Some people are using this, again, under transgender ideology to break down the patriarchy, all right, to destabilize the idea of one man and one woman and children, right? Some people are using it for political advantages. But a lot of people who are using it for political advantages are people who are not gender dysphoric or intersexed. Often gender dysphoric and intersex people are just trying to fit in and live a normal life. Right? Here you are just trying to live your life as a woman or as a man. You want to blend in. You don't want any attention. You just want to be yourself. And somebody's turning you into a breakdown of the patriarchy or something like that, right? Or a deconstruction of the gender binary, right? Well, if you're intersex, you don't have an objective to break down the sex binary, right? You have been born with a medical condition. It would be like somebody saying somebody born as a diabetic, is trying to break down. They're a promoter of the paleo diet, right? One is a fad, and one is a biological reality, right? They're not linking. Let's not link the two together. Now, in this little circle Venn diagram I have in the bottom, there are some people who are gender activists. There are some people who are intersex and gender dysphoric, and there are some people who are both activist and gender dysphoric and intersex, right? There are people who can be both, but we don't want to confuse both. We don't want to assume all gender dysphoric or intersex people are gender activists. Most gender activists are not, right? So the Congregation for Catholic Education points this out, and I think they are correct in that. And lastly, similar theories aim to annihilate the concept of nature. That is, everything we have been given as pre-existing foundations of our being and action in the world, while at the same time implicitly reaffirming its existence. Right? This is the stance of the stance of the Church over and over again. We must be true to our nature. Right? That's our nature. The idea that we forsake our nature and we do whatever we want is detrimental to the natural order, right? You could say natural law, but really there's just built into nature are consequences, where if you violate nature, there are paybacks, right? In terms of like environmental things like that. If you pollute the water, you will get sick, right? If you cut down all the trees, you'll end up with landslides and erosion and other problems. If you suck all the water out of the aquifers, the land dries up and we get a dust bowl. Right? There are just natural consequences, and you must follow nature, otherwise it will get you back. It was that line in my book. It said, God always forgives, humans sometimes forgives, nature never forgives. Right? Nature for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and that's what happens when you defy nature. An opposite reaction, which is not positive. Which also seems so against our current movement, which is all about organic, natural. You pay all this money for carrots at Whole Foods, so you get the natural carrots. At the same time, we have a society, a postmodern society, which rejects our own biology, right? We respect the biology of carrots, but we don't respect our own natural biology, which is ironic, right? So the response to this document was two kinds of responses. So one, the chair of the U.S. Bishops Committee, Michael Barber, who was a Jesuit, responded, in a difficult and complex issue, the clarity of the church's teaching, rooted in its equal dignity of men and women as created by God, provides light of truth and compassion, and that is most needed in the world today. So they said, yeah, this is good, right? This is a good document. It's very helpful, and it gives a clear response. Now you have people like Father Dan Horens, who I've talked about before. He says, call it what you like. Such things claim such claims appear tantamount to physical or emotional abuse, parent, spouse, or partner claiming that their violence is grounded in a place of tough love. In the end, it's simply abuse, adding the church must stop promoting the boogeyman of gender ideology. And Father Dan goes on to say we need to be listening to people like Judith Butler and other gender theorists rather than condemning them. This is, Father Dan Horan is the chair of the Duns Scotus Society, Theological Union. He's not a nobody. He's an important person in Catholic theology within the United States, but it's a kind of a tough stance. I don't know. It's the only objections that document had was to ideology, right? It actually praises feminism, right? It praises progress of feminism for half the document, right? That's pretty progressive, right? It criticizes overtly relativism, voluntarism, materialism, right? This is the church's stance, right? You can't even imagine what the Roman Catholic Church would look like if it promoted moral relativism as its stance. Like, it just, nothing is right or wrong any longer. There is no objective moral reality. Find this in the scriptures, right? Find this in the tradition of the church. Find this in rational, find this in Aristotle, right? Find this in anyone worth listening to. I can't imagine the church having a different stance philosophically. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's criticizing gender theorists who are politicizing transgender and intersex people, which I think is fair enough, right? There are plenty of transgender and intersex people who likewise criticize gender theorists who are politicizing them, right? So, again, not a particularly controversial thing. And it's saying that medical scientists should determine a person's sex when sex is indeterminate, right? And however medical science makes those determinations, they're kind of open to it. It's just saying society shouldn't determine for someone, somebody's parents shouldn't determine that for them, but it's a medical issue, therefore it should have a medical response. I don't think that's that conservative, right? Is it conservative to say that doctors should be looking after medical conditions? I don't know. I suspect it's more, this type of response is more a reaction to what the press says about documents like this, right? When a document like this comes out, everyone is very quick to make a very fast, rash response. And usually it's, are they pro-trans people or are they anti-trans people? And if they look at this, they go, oh, they're anti-transgender people. The article gets published, the church publishes an anti-transgender document, and people respond, see, why is the church picking on transgender people? Have you read the document? The answer is probably no, right? Probably no. Because you don't, as much as I think, especially when I first read it too, my initial thought was, I don't think that they're very clear with making certain distinctions. But the more I read it, the more I think, yeah, those are the right distinctions. Maybe they could have done a better job of laying it out, right? Maybe. Even within my own book, now that I look back at it, I can say, well, maybe I could have done a better job at laying it out, which is why I'm coming up with a parent's guide to the transgender issue, much more concise version, straight to the point, and hopefully clearer, unlike the current book, which is quite long. So from this CCE, one second. Okay. Those last two slides looks a lot like from the last section, and they were, so I don't have to do the last ones. But yeah, people, like in the article on Sister Louisa that I talked about last one, section 3.4, she has a group of transgender people who she's trying to keep connected with the church and offer a support for them. I know they were also very critical of this document, but again, I think, and I addressed this last video, I think people aren't reading the documents, they're reading what the press is saying about the documents, and I think the press does a terrible job of reporting on the church, right? They're either reporting what they want to hear or they're reacting against what they don't want to hear, but they're not actually reading or listening to what they're saying. If anybody wants to understand the churches, if any time the press reports on the church, on LGBT issues, what you have to realize is the press will 100% of the time get it wrong. You cannot believe a single thing they ever say when they report on this, because they don't understand the idea. And this is the idea. In a nutshell, the church is very against gender theory, this idea that it is all relative and subjective. And they are very much in favor of trying to support people who are actually suffering from actual conditions that they cannot help, right? Whether it's intersex or transgender, gender dysphoria, or any of the other parts of the LGBT thing. You know, if somebody is struggling with a condition, the church is trying to help, but what it is not in favor of is the ideology that's pushing the whole thing, and how people are using it, the whole LGBT rainbow, to try to deconstruct sex, nature, the family, and the natural order, right? They're just against it. The church is against it every time, right? That's just the nature of it. So when you get one document that's because, you know, one report says, oh, the Pope was in favor of transgender people. It's because he was talking about a transgender person, somebody with gender dysphoria, who he was reaching out to pastorally. That's why he's in favor of them. Then 6 months later, the Pope wrote this thing against transgender people. No, because he wrote a document, and he's addressing gender ideology. He does not see them as the same thing. Transgender people with gender dysphoria, and transgender or gender ideology are completely different in the mind of Pope Francis. They are completely different in the Holy See's perspective, and I think it's fairly clear that the Congregation for Catholic Education is maintaining that idea that they are against ideology but for people, right? And it's not the same as if you think, well, it's just the old-fashioned hate the sin and not the sinner. They're not even calling this sin. They're saying, it's like saying, like you love people with cancer, but you hate cancer, right? That's entirely different than hate the sin, love the sinner. One person has a condition, and one thing is the condition, right? You don't like the condition. You like the person who has the condition. That's a very different thing. Okay, that's it for this time. We're moving into more theological things next time.